What's up out there? It's Dave Duford. I am live. Yes, after last night and all the shenanigans with Facebook, they decided to not be live, and I have no idea why. Worked all day to figure it out. Worked on other accounts, but not on mine. But hey, I'm here live on Facebook with you at the new No BS Final Expense Training time of 9 p.m. Eastern Time. That's way past my bedtime in my old age in my 30s. And glad you made it. If this is your first video, this is the No BS Final Expense Training Program that I do every single week, where I highlight a training section specific to the final expense sales business. From carrier reviews, from taking questions from you, the audience, to training tips in general and specific. I cover it all here every week, now on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you so much for joining. And in today's topic, we're going to continue the process of teaching the final expense sales training model that I teach my agents. Last week we talked about the first step of the sales training model, which goes around the idea and concept of introduction, proper introduction, as well as building rapport with your agents. And of course, that was great and it's very important. And now we're going to get into the next step of the sales process, which is just as important, if not the most important part of the sales process. So much so that I think that it, in fact, is the least emphasized element of a salesperson's approach to doing business with selling final expense. So I find it extremely important and hopeful that you will see tremendous value out of actually listening and seeing some of these topics we're going to talk about regarding pre-qualifying and fact-finding. So, and that's the title of today's topic, pre-qualifying and fact-finding like a boss. So, what are we going to learn today? You may be wondering, so what exactly is pre-qualifying? Why should I even care? And how does it apply to my success at closing more final expense deals? Because shouldn't we all learn a million different objection rebuttaling points and phraseologies? Isn't that just enough to close people? Well, I want to present to you a new paradigm in thinking when it comes to selling really anything, and in this case, of course, in selling final expense. I believe the old days of assumptive, hard pressure closing is over. The tactics that were used and were successful in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s do not work today nearly as well as some of the new, more open-ended, question-based approach to selling. In fact, you must even alter your approach and belief patterns as to how selling even works. Not everybody is a prospect in the new sales model, whereas the old way of thinking, you think everybody you sit down with is a prospect. That is not the case. You can certainly act like it is, but it doesn't change the fact that not everybody you're going to sit with is going to buy with you. It's true of all salespeople. And what I realize as it relates to final expense is that after a period of time, I realized that the way Hollywood presents sales is just not real. If you can recall the most popular sales movies that are out there, the two that stick out in my mind is number one, which is Glengarry Glen Ross, great movie, as well as The Boiler Room. We're presented with salespeople who are hard closers. They are pitch meisters. They master the art of rebuttaling and objection handling and hard closing. And the problem with that perception of sales is that it just doesn't work with real people, especially in the context of life insurance. The reason it doesn't work is because, first of all, not everybody who sends a card back is actually going to have the capabilities or the desire to actually sit down and buy something from you. But the other reason that it doesn't work very well is the nature of the product we sell. This is the other reason why it's very important to pre-qualify. Because Mildred will always wake up tomorrow, and if she has buyer's remorse, which is very easy to get if one is pushed into something, they can simply call up the company and cancel the deal. You're not going to be able to babysit every feeling they ever get to cancel their policy. And so what happens, and where I kind of changed my approach to doing this business, was that why do we have to have this concept of constantly pushing people into something that may not be something that they want? Why don't we then change our approach to selling and try to meet the needs of the prospect, figure out what works for their budget, figure out what they really want to accomplish, and to do all these things right away in the beginning of the sales call without going into an entire pitch just to find out the person's broke, the person doesn't want what you want, and maybe they can't even admit that they don't want what you want to sell them, and they just aren't qualified for some reason. Why do all the frustrating work that traditional sales training teaches us when we could just bypass it all and focus on finding out as quickly as possible if the person we're sitting across the table is actually a qualified buyer, or qualified prospect at least, who matches our criteria for buying, or if they're an unqualified suspect that may look on the surface of being a prospect, but they're missing a crucial element. And what that comes down to is figuring out how to determine who's the best odds prospects to deal with and take your time working with. That's what my goal is in teaching pre-qualifying, because that is the critical element to success, in my opinion, in maximizing your time, having a more pleasurable and delightful experience selling people, but also having the pride and the good feelings of not having to waste your valuable time with deadbeats that really all they do is suck you dry if you're not careful. So the whole idea behind this is to teach you this approach and this method because it's so valuable that it's made my life easier. When I teach an agent how to do it, it makes their life easier because it changes the approach on how to sell and how to approach selling. You can be relaxed, you can be laid back. And what's cool about it is you actually create more rapport by doing this. You create more trust. And you really figure out what's going on in their head in the process of pre-qualifying. And so that upon the questions that I'm going to teach you how to do, and upon asking them correctly, what's cool is that the objections won't even come up at the end. The key significant factor of a good salesperson is that an excellent salesperson can anticipate objections before they come up and thus create a sales presentation that covers and eliminates those objections so that when the close happens, there's very little substantive objections that occur. What happens when, in those cases, if an objection occurs, it's usually just a stalling tactic like, let me think about it, or I don't know if I've got the money right now, stuff that you can overcome with a few simple objection techniques that aren't, necessarily high pressure, but designed to encourage tension in them to realize, hey, this is the time, let's do it, let's make you feel better. And so that you can focus on, again, rebuttaling objections from somebody who actually is very qualified so that you know that your effort is spent on somebody who's an awesome prospect, very qualified, and is very high odds of someone who's going to buy. So that is, that brings me to the big point is I think that, hopefully you can see with how enthusiastic I am about this, it's more important as a new final expense agent to master exactly what I'm about to teach, because the whole approach of learning all sorts of objections and all sorts of rebuttals to objections misses the point of what a sales call is about. A sales call is about learning what makes your prospect tick, is to sit down, become engaged with your prospect, figure out what matters to them, and then to determine from their own words and their own engagement level with you if they're actually a prospect and somebody who can actually buy from you. So that's what we're going to learn today. And we're going to go over how to figure out if these people, again, are prospects that are qualified in under 3 minutes or less, or if you need to leave and hit the door and go to the next one. I'm going to show you the 5 questions that I ask in every final expense sales call that allows me to dig deep and probe and figure out what is really on this person's mind and what makes them think the way they do, and figure out from those questions if they're really somebody who wants to buy what I'm selling. And I'm going to teach you how to ask effective health questions how to ask the questions in a way so that you don't get a lot of amendments, you don't get a lot of rate-ups, and a lot of frustrations running back and forth between the clients, because it's very important to learn how to ask those health questions to give you the best results in what you're doing, and to make sure you're spending time selling, not being a gopher back and forth trying to figure out how to get this policy actually placed. And then I'm going to teach you one of the best methods in pre-qualifying and fact-finding, what's called selling the premium. I'll just tease it a little bit. This is a method I learned when I first started from a guy in 2009 and 2010 who wrote $400,000 in final expense premium, more than that actually, in both years. I think this is the one technique I took from him and installed it into my sales training product or program and that I teach my agents, and it works great because it helps kill two birds with one stone, able to maximize your premium as well as to not disenfranchise your prospect in the process. So if you guys have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask. I've got a little chat down here. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to throw them out. I'd be happy to address them live. And again, thanks for joining me. So let's go ahead and get right into the pre-qualifying questions. Well, actually, we first started off in the email. I asked, I told you, I'd tell you, how do you figure out if somebody is high odds going to buy within the first 3 minutes? Well, it's something that takes a combination of repetitive training and repetitive experience and just looking for body cues and cues and engagement. So when I sit down with a prospect now, because I've done this for so long, I know fairly well as experienced agents will tell you as well, if the person I'm talking in front of is about talking with is actually a buyer or not. How do I do that? The biggest reason I do that is that I don't do nearly as much heavy rapport building as I used to. I get to know them just a little bit, just to get their guard down, to get them to laugh a little bit. That's really my primary goal. But then the main thing I try to accomplish is, once I get their guard down, I ask them this first of the 5 questions I'm going to teach you, which is, what were your thoughts and concerns when you decided to send this card back? That is the critical question that really establishes what is going on in their brains. It's going to tell you, not necessarily by what they say, but how they say it, how their body language is, how they're connected with you. They're going to tell you by those cues really how into what it is that they sent off and what they're interested in. And what I mean by that is that you can actually tell, once you're good, if somebody is sincerely interested by how they respond to questions. One thing I do when I take agents on ride-alongs, I'll ask them, I said, when I don't make a sale, I ask the person, what were your thoughts in the beginning when you sat across this person and listen to them respond and ask questions and what was their level of engagement? And invariably what happens is that they figure out that the level of engagement just isn't there from the very beginning. And what I mean by engagement is they're not answering questions in full truthfulness. They're not really giving detailed answers. They're kind of off-putting in the questions when you ask them. And this character, this establishment of how they respond and their character and their response is really indicative of what's to come the vast majority of time. Certainly, there are situations where people are off-putting to begin with, and then they open up and they tell you the truth, or that's just how they are stylistically, I guess, for lack of a better word. But it's you can't let that be the rule, because the exception to the rule is just an exception to the rule. The rule being that in the long term, you can really tell if somebody is vastly and seriously interested in their eye contact with you and how they respond to a question. They'll usually respond in full. Like when I asked that question I did, what were your thoughts and concerns when you sent the card back? They'll give you a detailed response. They'll tell you their life story. They'll tell you about their spouse or family member who died without insurance. They'll give you all the details, all the ammo you need to make a sale. And what's amazing is it was just the power of one singular question. And if you start hearing that stuff from the beginning, it blows your mind on how effective and awesome it actually works. So when you sit down with the prospect, the key takeaway here is once you get them to a point where you feel like they're reasonably at ease and comfortable with you, you tell them, transitionally speaking, hey, look, the reason I'm here, you sent this card back, you would request information about our final expense life insurance programs, and the reason I'm here is my job to show you how it works. My question to you, Mr. Prospect, is this. What were your thoughts and concerns when you decided to send this card back? And then zip, shut up, and let them tell you and lean back. That response to that, in that context of how you build rapport and establish a base level of trust, will allow you to really figure out pretty quickly if you're good in 3 minutes or less. Hey, if you're not that good and you like to let them talk a little bit, 5 or 10 minutes, you're going to know with increasing certainty based on that first question where they stand. So that's how we know what we kind of get a good feel for intuitively if they're going to be a buyer or not. But the main thing about pre-qualifying is the questions that you ask. Questions are the most critical part to a salesman's repertoire. It's not the objections, the objection rebuttals. It's none of that. It's what questions do you ask? How do you ask the questions, and how well do you probe into the responses to those questions? I am a firm believer that the best salesperson is the person who is buying that product. And what better way to hear somebody's thought processes than to actually let them speak about what matters to them? That's kind of cool if you think about it. I mean, if you let somebody, a lot of people don't converse about the importance of purchasing something. But when we hear ourselves tell us ourselves that something is cool or something is good, it's kind of like a neuro-linguistic programming, I guess you could say, where we're hearing ourselves say it, so it must be somewhat true. And it builds the case in their own mind about the urgency, about the importance, about why this is critical to have. And if you let them do that, if you're patient and you ask good questions, it's just amazing the kind of responses that you get back from these people and the kind of story that they give you. And all of that's packed with emotion, and it's packed with everything you need. As I like to say, it gives you the ammo to make the sale by asking these powerful, open-ended questions. So the first question I ask, and I'm going to tell you the questions and why I ask them. So the first question, of course, was what were your thoughts and concerns about sending the card back? This is just a preliminary opening question to get a really good idea of what's making them tick. You know, are they extremely interested? Are they mildly interested? Are they just curious? You know, what is it exactly that prompted them to send this card back? And you'll get all sorts of responses. If you get the response back where they say, well, I was just curious. You know, you get some non-response. The best thing you can do is ask them, so how do you mean by curious? Again, ask them again. Let them go ahead and take another whack at opening up and sharing more of the reasons, the logic and emotion as to why they did what they did. If that fails, I love to use the quote-unquote 3 questions routine that I learned from one of the best final expense agents in the business named John Duggar, who lives in Western Kentucky. This guy's been in business 10 years. He is one of my, I guess, not a direct mentor per se, but I modeled a ton of what I do based off of what John says. And much of his outlook and perspective on final expense sales is a lot in how I do things. Not exactly the same, but a lot of my approach mirrors what a guy that writes $200,000 a year for years now, and with this particular line of questioning. And what he asks is this. He says there's typically, and again, I'm asking this question only if the person can't give me a substantive, engaging response. So this is a leading question, but I lead the way to get a little bit more out of them. So what I ask is this. Well, Mrs. Jones, typically there's 3 situations that people are in as to why they send this card back. The first one is they don't have any insurance. And if they die, it's on a spouse, it's on a kid, and they're worried. The second situation is they don't have enough coverage. They got some, maybe they've had it for a while, but they see how fast the price of funerals are going up, and they're concerned. and they know they should add some extra. And then the third situation is they've got enough. They could die and have enough coverage to pay for the burial, but they want to leave extra behind to a grandkid or a spouse to pay for final expenses or other final expenses like credit card debt or car debt, that kind of thing. So my question to you is this, Mr. Prospect. Out of those three situations, the first being no coverage, the second you need more coverage, and the third being you got enough but want extra, which do you fit in best? And then zip it and let them respond. So what this does is it builds a little value. It explains in kind of a third-party validation approach what situations everybody is in, and it gives them the choice to fit out of those three situations. Where do they fit? Very rarely will you ever have anybody say, none. But you'll have people who'll say, well, they'll give you a kind of a weak answer. And so, but most of the time, you're going to hear typically number one or number two. You don't really hear number three that often, but it's a mixture of one and two. And what I also like to add, I'll add this too, I forgot to add this in the second question. Sometimes I'll add, some people have some coverage, but it's either really expensive and they want a better deal, or they're looking to add additional coverage. So I plant the seed that you can also potentially get a better deal. And so that leads to the next section of figuring out who they have the coverage with, and then I start collecting that information to hopefully potentially draw out the replacement type of sale. So that progresses that question is important because it progresses the pre-qualification point past maybe a little initial stall or hesitancy in the prospect. Next question I like to ask here is, what kind of experience have you been through regarding paying for final expenses? In a sense, what I'm asking is, have you ever experienced somebody dying and not having coverage? What's your experiences been from that? And so that allows them to, again, share with you stories about negative experience or positive, where someone had insurance, how easy it was, how the peace of mind was there for the family, or really, which is the most powerful, the negative experience. We all remember and are fear-based in our memories and emotions, as far as I think the strongest emotions. And sharing a negative experience is just as powerful. My husband died. I'm still paying on the funeral. 5 years later, my kids didn't chip in. Or the kids had to chip in, I couldn't afford it, and embarrassment, blah, blah, blah. But the point of them sharing that story with you is going to bring out the emotion, the urgency, and a story that you can later reference if they do have some sort of, stalling. I need to think about this or talk about it with my daughter. These things that do happen even to qualified prospects. So again, by asking these questions, we're getting these cool stories, and we're going to be able to use that in a sense of closing the sale later on, but also, again, gaining insight as to what makes these people think and what's important to them. Once I ask that, I'll ask them straight up. So tell me, Mrs. Prospect, what would you like your final expense policy to do for you when you pass away? And so part one of that is it's an assumptive question. A slightly, subtly assumptive question. I'm not asking you want a final expense plan, don't you? I'm not doing a directly assumptive, closed-ended question. But what I am asking is assuming that they're going to buy a policy, and I'm trying to sell them past the sale. Envisioning what this thing's going to do when they buy it, and so they can visualize why they would have it to begin with and why it's important to them. And so what I'm trying to gather out of this is, what do they want it to do? Do they want it to pay for a burial, a cremation? Do they want just extra money? Do they want their kids to be at ease because they've got extra bucks in the bank? It doesn't matter to me. I just want to know what they think is important to them. Again, this is stuff that we use when we present and go back to build value in the presentation side as well as in the closing side, when we can rehash what they mentioned here in the beginning. And then I do also ask as well, do you want to be buried? And tell me what you know. I'm sorry, do you want to be buried or cremated? And tell me what you know about how final expenses are today or how expensive it is to pay for final expenses today. But more specific, the real question I'm asking more often than not is, do you want to be buried or cremated? A very open-ended A or B question. But but what happens from that questioning is that then I ask them, so what's your experiences with the cost of a burial? And then they'll tell me, well, I don't know, or God, it's $10,000 to $15,000 or whatever. And then I can I can take that, whatever their answer is, and say, that's right. What we see is the average cost of a burial is $3,000 to $5,000. You really need to at least have $5,000 if you want to make sure you've got enough coverage for inflation and prices going up. And or same thing for a funeral. And when you look at the whole cost of the casket, the tombstone, whatever, it's going to come out to about that much. And if you can do it, $7,000 to $10,000 somewhere in there is fine. If you walk in a funeral home and all you got $7,000, they're going to work with you. They're not going to let $7,000 walk down the street. That stuff keeps the lights on and pays the bills. So that's, and what's cool about that, you may be wondering, well, how much value or how much do I talk about the prices of burial? That's it. I don't ever go into any more detail than a cursory 30 to 60 second explanation. It's wild, right? I'm not breaking out a price sheet and saying, look at all this stuff. Because what happens is these people already have in mind what they want, how much they want. They have a range. They're more concerned about do they have the money. That's where my concern is let's get you something you can afford, and something's better than nothing. And that's a tactic I'll teach later on in another live stream. But the idea here is, again, just to get an idea of in their minds, and validate their ideas they had in their mind already with some logic. Again, logic justifying the emotion. Jesus is so expensive to bury. Oh my gosh. And yes, it is, because here's the breakdown. Excuse me. So that I can ultimately justify the face amounts and the coverage amounts, and validate that, at least from my perspective, as a person of authority. So those are the primary 5 questions. Again, what were your thoughts and concerns when you sent back the card? What kind of experience have you been through regarding the paying for final expenses? What would you like your final expense policy to do for you when you pass away? And do you want to be buried or cremated? And then the 3 reasons, no coverage, some coverage, or want a better deal, or enough but want extra. Those are the primary questions you need to ask in a final expense sales call all the time. These are critical. You will discover everything you need to know, for the most part, about what the needs and the wants and desires are of the prospect, because this is the foundation on which your sale rests. And if you ask and take the time to do it, which really doesn't take a lot of time, it's probably a 5 to 10 minute process, probably less time intensive than it does explain it on camera. But if you can do it and take notes, note critical things that they say and stories they relate to, very powerful stuff to make a sale and close it with urgency later on down the line. So, yeah, hey, how you doing, guys? I see Mr. Christopher Smith. Thanks for joining. Let's see. Okay, Chris. Yes, Chris. Daniel. I'm going to read some comments from you guys here before I go to the next point. Chris says, how do you handle, I don't know why I filled this out. That's where I use the 3 questions line. What I see, Mr. Prospect, is, the guys people are in one of 3 situations. So I go through that routine. When I hear that, again, those are what I would call and categorize into what's called knee-jerk objections. Chris, if you're listening to this, you probably have heard this many a times where you sit down and they say, I'm not buying anything today. We think about this stuff. We pray about this stuff. I'm just letting you know that. That doesn't mean anything. You just simply need to say, that's fine, and then you continue your sales process, because that reaction is unsubstantiated. There's no rational reason as to why they do it, right? They don't have any basis of what you're really selling. They don't know the products, they don't know the prices, they don't know the value. They're just blurting something out, and it's kind of just like a reaction. It just that makes them feel better. And I think sometimes the verbiage or the language of, I don't know why I filled this out, it may be a dismissive element. They may have want the free insurance, if you know what I mean. But it doesn't matter. If you listen to it, hey, as you know, there may be a replacement sale in there. So you just want to progress as easily as possible, progress past that. And give them 3 reasons. That's why that 3-question line is really effective, because then you get some ideas as to what they're saying, or what may be there, or underlying needs that they don't know about. That's another important element here that we use to figure out, again, is there something there more than we can see? Hopefully that makes sense. You want to get past the initial stall tactics to figure out, yeah, I've got this AARP plan. Oh, really? Is it term insurance? Yeah. Now you can build a need and try to figure out if it's already in them to be important to replace that with better coverage or better price or whatever is underlying. Daniel, how you doing, sir? It works, but the life stories can sometimes take forever. Absolutely. I can reiterate that. Yes. I remember when I started as an insurance agent or final expense, I would literally let people talk as long as they could, because, and I still believe it to some extent, it's, people buy from who they like, and these people are lonely, and they don't have a lot of people to share their lives with, and the salesmen get the brunt of it. And what happens is you almost have to be a little rude, not rude, but you got to look for a moment in time to just get back in there and take control of the sales call, because it will kind of drag on and on and on and on and drive you crazy. Absolutely. Salehi, how you doing, sir? People are so programmed to hear large coverage dollar amounts. When I give monthlies for $10,000 or $15,000, it's deflating. What's your approach? What would you quote term? That's a great question. I think what happens is that I think a lot of what you're going to experience, that people who say and experience that kind of stuff, typically they do so because they are younger and they watch the select quote advertisements, and they've been getting this stuff from term non-med guys from their credit unions where they're saying $100,000 for $10, and they've got this thing programmed in their mind that that's normal. And even you'll sit down with people who have term insurance, and I always kind of like, I got to sit down with the term prospect, and here we are in a situation where they are probably going to be shocked when their premium they're paying is going to be and represent maybe a third to a half in face amount. And I think what's important is that we're not selling face as much as we're selling peace of mind. We're at an affordable, maintainable budget. And so I think, again, it goes back to pre-qualifying. What happens is, why did they send the card in? What do they want to accomplish? And, what is it exactly that's important to them? And, figuring out from there if it makes sense. Now, one thing I'll tell you is that when I sit down with a prospect and I find they have term, I got $50,000 in term insurance, I'm paying $40 a month. I like what's called the devil's advocate ploy. This is something I learned a long time ago that, to me, really, it allowed me to figure out quickly if the person would sincerely consider a base set of options. So let me explain it maybe a little bit better. So somebody says, hey, I got $50,000 for $40 a month. I said, great. I said, well, certainly it sounds like you've got enough cover. You're telling me you want to burial, you don't want extra left over. And this is in the pre-qualification stage, by the way. I said, Mr. Jones, it sounds like you're all set. I mean, I don't really see a reason you'd want any more. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, do you really even need more coverage? And a lot of people say, oh crap, you're not selling them. You're going to lose the sale. But what happens is that people who want a policy or who want or believe in insurance, when you do a takeaway, it's essentially a takeaway in sales, which means it's like you show them something but you take it away. And if they want it, they'll reach for it. So it's the same concept here, is that if you do this stuff and you take that away from them, they'll sell you on why you should sell them. If they don't give you a good reason, then what you find out is they're not really a prospect all that much. So what happens is that, I'll tell you honestly, with the term insurance stuff, it's very difficult to take somebody who is conceptually not sold on whole life insurance. Well, I wouldn't say they're conceptually sold, but they're blown away by the price, because a lot of these people ultimately are price buyers, and the thing is they've been conditioned to at that price, and that's what they're accustomed to. Maybe in those situations, you would quote them term. I mean, I've never done it, just because it's a hassle and it usually never works out for me, at least. I just tell them, look, the good news when I go down to closing them is, the good news is you got good coverage. Bad news, it's going to go away. But you're not going to get as much if you get the permanent kind of coverage. I tell them this stuff up front in the preliminary process, and I say, look, I can show you this stuff. I mean, what's your thoughts on getting the same price but half the coverage, but you're never going to lose it? Is that something you would be willing to buy? I mean, I'll flat out ask them stuff like that, because I've just discovered it. Again, this is just me. It may not work or be true for everybody. I just figure that, you can ask those questions and you're going to get a good response. And a level of selling or trying to push somebody to go from 25 to 12 at the same price, who's just conceptually not bought into it, or at least just doesn't believe it initially, very, very often it's just a waste of time. And I got tired of doing that for many years and figured out, let's just take care of this up front. Here's what's going to happen. Here's the good, here's the bad. Would you be willing to switch based on those or not? Either way is fine with me. And it saves my time. I can go see somebody who's a much better prospect. Okay, let's see. Yeah, very true, Daniel. I've been on a point where people just really want to talk to somebody. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's this business, baby. All right, Chris, outside of complicated policy reviews, how long do you find a bread and butter presentation with a sale should take? I think the longer sit-downs tend to lead to more issues in the end. Great question. As a new agent, probably for me about an hour to an hour and 20 to hour and 30 is what I would do as a new agent. But I would let these people ramble on. All right. As an experienced agent now, I can close a couple, and I never thought I could do this in like 40 to 50 minutes. And the large reason for that is the rapport introduction stage went from 20 minutes to 2 to 5 minutes. That's like my average. Okay. And I handle, like I said in addressing the last question, I handle a lot of this stuff up front. So we take care of some of this stuff that I know normally is going to be an issue with most people I see. So that, again, I ain't wasting my time if they've got a problem or if there's some condition to doing a sale. Again, an objection is something that can be overcome, whereas an objection or a condition is something that cannot. And so I try to take care of the conditions, or what I perceive to be potential conditions, earlier on in the process. Let's see. For young people, it's not bad. I got $1 million for 36 fixed 30 years. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the same. The only reason, and again, that's more because those are non-prospects for final expense. But you and your wife are typical term buyers, whereas when you're going to see a 50-year-old or even a 60-year-old that has term and they're got a great deal, and it's an uphill battle to try to squeeze 3 times the payments out for the same face, or a third of the coverage for the same price. Best way to replace a UL policy after it's collapsed and it's gone up in price. Let's put it to you short. Those are probably, just like these term products, for me, are the most difficult I've had to actually replace. The last UL, yeah, exactly. I see that, Daniel. That's true. People procrastinate, man, and people do stuff when the gun's against their head. When there's no other way to procrastinate than they got to do something, or else they just can't afford it. They can't pay the rent. When you catch people in those cycles, like with their UL policies, those are the best options for replacements. A lot of people, again, you get somebody who's 60, they've got $50,000, they're paying $40 from a UL they bought in the 80s when interest rates were, super high relative to today, and you go through this process of showing them the annual statement, what's going on, how it's going to go up, how the cash value is eating down. It's like, yeah, I see that, and a lot of times that's what happens. Whereas if it's gone up a couple times, they're pissed. And if you get somebody who's pissed, they're ready to make a buying decision. I would say most of my UL replacements, I don't run across much anymore, but most of them that I do see that are in the final expense age range, they've had a couple of price increases. I had one that went from $30 to $200. That's when he made his switch. And he saw it coming. He even said, some agent came over 10 years ago and said, yeah, you should switch this because it's going to go up. And he was like, whatever. Here he is paying $200 a month when he could have been paying $60. All right, so moving on here. If you guys got any more questions, feel free to. Man, this bad boy moves fast. It's already been 40 minutes. You guys staying with me. I appreciate it. All right, so let's go ahead and ask your questions. I'll address them at the very end. The last two sections I want to cover real quickly are effectively asking health questions and how to sell the premium. So the key to asking effective health questions, and this is after you've asked all the health questions, the way I transition into is I say, okay, cool. So now that I've asked you some basic questions, let me ask you a little bit more about your health so I can get an idea of what the price is going to be and what you're going to qualify for. So I always run through a specific routine of questions. I usually start with, do you have COPD, or I should say, what's your date of birth, do you smoke? And I always, with any question, whatever they say, I always probe one level deeper. So, for example, when they tell me, I ask them, do you smoke? They say, yes. I say, cool, so do you use tobacco, or I should say, do you smoke cigarettes, chew tobacco, or use cigars? So I go one level deeper because you can have a lung problem, right? For example, but it's just asthma. Or you could have COPD and not take oxygen. Or you could have COPD and then not have used inhalers for years and potentially have some options for better than standard or modified coverage if you have your carriers and you know your carriers well. So you always want to go one step below in the questions. You have diabetes, great. Do you take pills or insulin? Do you have diabetic neuropathy? How many units do you take a day? When did you start? So you want to get very, very specific all the time on the front end. With each question you ask, they answer yes to something, get deeper. At the very end of those questions, of course, I ask them to grab their prescriptions, okay? You never want to trust them to, by memory, deliver to you what prescriptions they take. You want to actually have them physically grab the prescription so they can show you them and make sure, is there any others you got on your lamppost in your bed or anything like that? And then physically write them down. And then I always ask by saying, I always summarize what you've told me is this, and you take these medications for that. And then I ask them, is there any other health issue you have that I haven't mentioned? So that kind of wraps it up and potentially grabs other things we may have missed. Yes, I'm very, very thorough in the line of questioning. By the way, if you're watching this still and you're interested in a pre-qualification sheet that has these health questions, go ahead and you see what we can do. I'm going to put my email here. No, I'll just tell you to do this. Go to my website, go to the contact page, and say, Dave, I want the pre-qualification worksheet. I'll send it to you. It's the one I give my agents just totally for free, no obligation, won't harass you. Ask me for it, I'll send it to you. Again, go to my website, go to contact, and say, Dave, give me the pre-qual worksheet, and I'll be happy to provide that. The last thing I'll mention is the old Tim Winders sell the premium routine. Mr. Tim Winders, who is a chief partner with Your Insurance Group, wonderful man, and an excellent final expense agent. This is the guy I mentioned in the beginning that wrote $400,000 2 years in a row in 2009, 2010 in the lovely state of Iowa, North and South Dakota, I think. He's taught the concept of selling the premium. So what's selling the premium? Selling the premium is the difference between Let me rephrase. Selling the premium is where you figure out what premium the client can afford, versus selling the face amount, where you present a face amount or various face amounts, and hope that they can afford one of those. The reason I like selling the premium is very simple. When you sell the premium, and you back it up with a phraseology that lowers their defenses and builds trust, you can gain the right to ask for a high premium. So let me give you the phrasing exactly as to how it works. Mrs. Jones, my last question for you is this. Like I said in the beginning, 9 out of 10 people that I see are disabled or retired. It means they get one check a month. They don't have a money tree out back. They got to make sure what they buy is absolutely affordable and that it does what it's supposed to without breaking the bank. And the reason I'm saying this, and I don't mean to beat the bush here, is that I don't want my clients to take out a policy and 6 months drop it, okay? That's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your money. And it doesn't do me any good as an agent as well. And here's the truth, Mrs. Jones. The best policy to have is the one that's there when you pass away. And the one that's there when you pass away is the one that you can afford. It's the one you can keep when you buy it for as long as you live. So here's my question to you, Mrs. Prospect. Based on your budget and what you can afford, could you afford somewhere between the range of, say, $80 to $100 a month for a final expense plan? And then be quiet, as I've said, and let them tell you. Now, most of them will say, hell no. And then my rebuttal to that is, that's fine, Mrs. Jones. Let me ask you this. If I could get you another plan that could do the same thing or something very similar, how about with something in the $50 to $75 range fit your budget? So what I've done here is very simple. I've lowered their defenses, I've gained their trust, and I've made it clear, abundantly clear, I only want them to afford something they can afford or buy something they can afford. I don't want to waste their money. I don't want to take their money and then have it drop in a month or 6 months even. So I've gained the right and I've gained their understanding that that's my primary concern. So with that, I can ask for the higher premium with them knowing that, you know, I'm not going to hold it to them or I'm not going to push them into something. That's the idea and the intent. But what it allows you as the agent is that it allows you to grab a better premium, hopefully, and than you would if you just offered a $50 and a $60, $40, $50, $60 arbitrarily. So you can custom design it to the affordability of the client and hopefully keep them better because you know they can afford that premium going into the presentation where you start to explain things. And you've got a trial close out of them. They tell you right up front, yes, I can afford it. I can afford $100. You know I can't. When you give them 50, I can do 50, I think. 50, yes, for sure. Yeah, I can do 50 for sure. So you know as you progress, you've got a trial close, an affirmative response on their budget. You know you've got that down. And one thing I didn't mention is you've qualified for the bank account. You do ask that in the pre-qualification phase. And that's powerful. So you're not going to get the I can't afford it objection nearly as much. So in conclusion here, pre-qualifying, I hope I've made my point. We're at nearly 50 minutes into this bad boy. And what happens is that, you know, this is why pre-qualifying is so important. This has flown by for me. I don't know about you yourself, but the elements of pre-qualification are so important. It's really important to get deep into it because it's super powerful and important. The whole point and the purpose of this phase in the sales call is to do 4 things. To know what the need is, to know what the reason for sending the card is and what they want to accomplish, as well as and that means their needs and what their desires are. But it's also to establish what their health is, so you know what carrier they qualify for. It also lets you see whether or not they can actually set up a bank draft. And that's something I didn't mention. I'll mention it very briefly. I asked them, hey, look, this is how it works. We set up a bank draft. It's convenient for your time that you get your check every month. I'm not going to tell you when to do it. I don't need the money today. We'll start it next month. You can do it on the same day or day after. Just want to make sure that's okay. So I'm flat out, straight up, here's how it's going to work. So I know health, bank, desire, need, and then budget. I know all this critical information before I even present what I do, before I even attempt to ask for the sale. My question is this: with all this knowledge and information, how much more powerful is it in a position to be in to sell this stuff, to present what we do? Because now you're presenting to somebody that meets all the criteria that you need in order to make a sale. You're not wasting your time pitching a person to this position. However, if you have somebody who has a bank account, who has the health, who has the need, but they don't have the budget, you can present to that person, but that's a suspect. That meets the criteria of certain things, but doesn't meet all of them. And the problem with that is that you're not going to be able to sell a broke person. Okay? If they can't commit to a premium, they can't say, yes, I can afford that. It's all for naught. You're wasting your time. Same thing if they don't have a bank account. Same thing if they don't have a need, and they can't tell you verbally what's the importance of having policy. This is why I think it's powerful, because it structures the sales call in a way that you can look at it and objectively see if this person is somebody you should have a high odds chance of working with and trying to sell and potentially converting. Hopefully that makes sense, because this is the most powerful section. Because with that knowledge you've ascertained, you have a high odds prospect or you don't. And you can make the determination if this is worth presenting to or going to the next one or not. So questions here. E-cigs now, are they considered pipes? Depends on the carrier. Somebody told me Prudential takes e-cigs as non-smokers. I don't know much beyond that, especially for final expense. Final expense, not so much the case with most carriers. If you're an e-cig smoker, you're a smoker. Chris asked, devil's advocate, but Mr. Agent, what does $80 to $100 buy me? So what I'll ask for that. So remember, at this point, we know what they're wanting to accomplish, right? One thing I do that's a little different than selling the premium is I know my premium ranges and age ranges really well. So somebody says, I want a $10,000 policy, and they're 70, they don't smoke, and they're female. I know that I'm not going to ask them for $100. I'll ask them, I'll say, if I can find you a plan you can afford, would somewhere between, say, $55 and $70 fit your budget? So if they say, well, what's that afford me? I already know the answer to that, right? I can just say, hey, that's fine. Most likely this is going to cover what you need. You can certainly not do that and just ask for the $80, say, hey, it's going to cover what you need and extra. You know, could you, considering that in mind, Mrs. Prospect, if you got what you need and you got some extra, can you afford $80 to $100 a month? Would that fit your budget? And then just rebuttal it back and let them tell you. They'll, just say yes or no. And if they don't give you a yes, you cannot proceed past that point. That's huge. You need a yes 100%, not a maybe, not a I think so. You need a yes, I can afford this. If they say anything other than that, they're not committed, and you need to lower the price in order to get buy-in. Okay, my problem was keep everything in a row without jumping around about what I'm talking about as we talk. I'm not sure what you mean there, Daniel, but that's okay. The key to this business is focus. That's for sure. What you find out with most final expense agents is that's all they do. And they keep running the same presentation, same leads over and over again with complete laser focus. That's how it works. So anyways, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been much longer than I anticipated. Not a problem, though. This is an important topic at hand to discuss, and I do hope that you learned a ton. Again, I would highly advise that you watch this again. Take notes. Check up with this. And again, if you're interested in the pre-qualification question, just go to my website, click the contact box, and then you're welcome to go ahead and request that pre-qualification worksheet. I'll get it to you. Thanks, guys, for sticking with me late. My name is David Duford at Final Expense Agent Mentor at feagentmentor.com. If you're interested in learning more about what we do in the final expense business and you'd like to potentially work with us, just drop me a line again. Go to the website, click the contact box, and submit a form. It's the best way to reach out to me, and we'll set up a consultation call. And guys, y'all have a good evening. Thumbs up. Thanks for listening. Take care.